I was 17 years old the night my lungs betrayed me in the living room of our drafty wooden house outside Madison, Wisconsin, where winter storms rattled the windows and the cold seemed to seep straight into my ribs as I felt the terrifying clamp of an asthma attack locking down every breath. It was 10:47 at night, and the only light came from the flickering television where my father sat half-slumped with a beer in his hand, while my mother rubbed her temples and muttered that she was tired and needed a moment of quiet before dealing with anything else. My chest tightened so fast it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, and I reached blindly for the inhaler I kept on the coffee table, only to see my brother Ben stride forward with exaggerated concern that dissolved almost instantly into a smirk that sliced through the panic rising in my throat. He plucked the inhaler from the table with theatrical ease, holding it just out of reach as my knees buckled, and I dropped to the floor, clawing at the carpet fibers while my lungs spasmed so violently I could hear the whistle of failed breaths rattling inside my own skull. "Timon, breathe harder," he taunted, bending closer and letting out an exaggerated wheeze that echoed my desperate struggle, while his eyes gleamed with the same cold delight I had seen 100 times whenever he discovered a new way to remind me that weakness was something he believed I deserved. I tried to speak, but my throat collapsed inward, and the room blurred at the edges as I crawled toward him, reaching for anything my fingers could grip while he stepped backward, lifting the inhaler higher as though rewarding himself for every second I remained trapped inside the shrinking prison of my own lungs. My mother glanced over her shoulder, sighed in annoyance, and said she could not handle another dramatic episode, while my father, without taking his eyes off the screen, muttered that siblings needed to work things out on their own and that he would not interfere in another pointless dispute. The sound in my ears grew hollow like I was sinking underwater, and every pull for air scraped fire down my chest as I dragged myself forward again. But Ben moved faster, pressing his foot onto my hand with careless force that sent a bolt of pain up my arm and toppled me backward onto the cold wooden floor. "If you were not such a burden, maybe we would care," he said softly, almost conversationally, as if he were offering helpful advice, while the lights in the room stretched into long streaks, and my vision tunneled toward darkness that pulsed like a slow heartbeat deep behind my eyes. As the last threads of air slipped away, I felt my body fold inward, and a heavy numbness washed over me, carrying me somewhere far from the living room where the sound of my brother's laughter mixed with the indifferent hum of the television and the faint clink of my father's beer bottle against the arm of his chair. I remember the sensation of floating as though my mind had detached from my body and was watching the scene from somewhere high above, unable to intervene and unable to breathe as the world dissolved into a white static that crackled softly like snow falling on frozen ground. When awareness returned, it did not come gently but snapped into place with the harsh brilliance of fluorescent lights that cut through my eyelids and forced my eyes open to a blur of movement and sterile white walls and the muffled beeping of monitors that seemed to count each fragile breath clawing its way back into my chest. A doctor leaned over me, adjusting a mask that covered my face and speaking in a calm, measured voice, telling me that I had been unconscious for nearly 3 hours, and that someone had dropped me at the emergency room entrance before driving away without leaving a name or any explanation. The realization seeped into me slowly that no one from my family had come to check whether I was alive, and that the same people who watched me collapse on the floor had chosen silence over responsibility even when the stakes were life itself, and the weight of that truth settled on my chest heavier than the asthma ever had. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic hiss of oxygen flow, and felt a cold clarity rising inside me, a certainty that the events of the night were not an accident or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate act of cruelty that revealed more about my family's intentions than any words they had ever spoken. The doctor stepped away to update a chart, leaving me with the soft mechanical beeps that filled the room, and with the hollow understanding that whoever brought me in did so only to avoid the consequences of letting me die at home, and that their absence now spoke louder than any apology ever could. I closed my eyes briefly, and in that moment I felt something quiet and resolute settle inside me, a recognition that survival meant more than breathing, that it meant seeing the truth without flinching and admitting that the people who should have shielded me from harm had instead become the source of the danger I barely escaped. I breathed as steadily as I could through the mask, letting the sterile air push back against the fading memory of suffocation, and when I finally opened my eyes again, the truth rose in me with the certainty of a verdict that the night I collapsed on the floor was the night my family showed me exactly who they were. Every breath afterward carried the memory of what they chose. That was the night I realized my family was not careless. They wanted me gone. 21 years have passed since the night my lungs closed and the world I trusted collapsed under the weight of my family's indifference. Now, at 38, I live in Seattle in a modest condo that overlooks the gray water of Lake Union, where morning fog curls like quiet memory. I work as a lead respiratory technician in a busy hospital, and every shift reminds me of the fragile distance between breath and silence. My life is stable with supportive colleagues, gentle friends, and a soft orange cat named Maple who curls beside me whenever the nights feel unsettled. I tell people I left home for college and never looked back, but the truth is that I carried that living room floor inside my chest for decades. Even now, when a patient gasps for air, I feel a tremor deep in my ribs as if 17-year-old me still reaches across time pleading for release. I have not spoken to my family in more than 15 years, partly out of self-preservation and partly because silence felt safer than reopening wounds that had never healed. People sometimes ask about my parents and brother, and I give careful, polite answers that slide past the truth, because most hearts are not built to hold cruelty that grows inside a home. I thought distance would be enough to keep their shadows from reaching me. Yet trauma has a strange persistence and often rises through memory like a cold tide against the shoreline. That persistence returned on a quiet Tuesday evening as rain tapped against my window and I sorted through a week's worth of unopened mail without the slightest expectation that my past was about to resurrect itself. Most of the envelopes were routine bills, newsletters, and hospital notices that could wait. Yet one thick cream-colored envelope bore my name in a precise, unfamiliar script that made my stomach tighten. I held it for a long moment, sensing an old dread stirring, as though the paper itself carried the echo of that winter night and the breath I almost lost. When I finally opened the envelope, my hands trembled despite the years that had passed because the first words I saw were mandatory appearance followed by a court seal from King County. I read the document slowly, trying to process each sentence, as though comprehension might soften whatever blow waited at the end, but nothing prepared me for the line that named the defendant. The name was Ben Collins, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt as if gravity had shifted because I could not reconcile the man who once pressed his foot onto my hand with the person now entangled in a legal dispute that somehow required my testimony. I sat down on the couch, gripping the subpoena, while an old familiar tremble crept upward from my ribs to my throat, a reminder that my body still kept score of every wound time had failed to erase. Why would a court summon me after so many silent years, and what connection could exist between my brother and a case that demanded the presence of a sister he had long since discarded? I read the subpoena again and saw the name of the plaintiff, a woman named Marisol Green, and her name reverberated inside me like a signal from a distant shore. I wondered how she knew anything about my past and whether she understood the weight of invoking a story I had buried so deeply that even I avoided its edges. For hours, I sat there listening to the rain while that single unfamiliar name reshaped my night, reminding me that trauma does not remain still but pulses forward the moment someone calls it into the open. Eventually, I set the subpoena on the table beside Maple, who blinked up at me with slow, curious eyes as if sensing the sudden heaviness that had settled across my bones. I whispered that everything was fine even though the air in the room felt charged with the electricity of old memory and the fragile peace I had built seemed to waver at its foundation. Still, I opened the envelope once more, tracing Marisol Green's name, and feeling something shift inside me, a blend of dread and responsibility that reached back to a frightened girl gasping for breath on a winter floor. I carried the subpoena to my kitchen and poured a glass of water, hoping the coolness would steady me. Yet the weight of that document pressed deeper with each breath, as if reminding me that the past I fled was awake again. I thought about the young woman who had filed the complaint against Ben and wondered what cruelty she endured and whether it echoed my own suffering in ways she could not have known. I recognized a stirring of anger, a quiet, steady pulse that came not from hatred toward my family, but from the understanding that silence would allow Ben to torment someone else as he once tormented me. Responsibility settled over me, a heavy, warm certainty that whatever waited in that courtroom was no longer just about the girl who lost her breath on a frozen Wisconsin night, but about every person who might fall into my brother's hands. As that truth anchored itself inside me, I felt a steadying determination rise through the old fear, a recognition that surviving the past had given me the strength to confront it when the moment finally arrived. I returned to the living room, sat on the couch, and stared at the subpoena while Maple settled on my lap and purred as if lending me a quiet, borrowed courage. With a long, slow breath, I opened the document once more and read the final line that directed me to appear in court, and beneath it, the name of the woman whose path would soon collide with mine. Her name was Marisol Green. The moment settled. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual with the uneasy feeling that the subpoena had followed me into sleep and hovered somewhere above my pillow, waiting for acknowledgement. I made coffee, but the smell did nothing to clear the heaviness in my chest, and even the soft clinking of Maple's paws on the kitchen tile sounded sharper than normal, as though the world had gone slightly out of tune. I sat at the small table by the window, where the Seattle skyline glowed faintly through thinning clouds, and opened my laptop with hesitant fingers. The name Marisol Green lingered in my mind like a question I had avoided answering for too long, so I began with the simplest search, typing her name into the browser bar and holding my breath as the results appeared. The first link was a workplace blog entry published 3 months earlier. And although I had no context for the post, the preview text alone made my pulse stumble. It mentioned bullying, manipulation, and a toxic supervisor who used charm to hide cruelty. I clicked it before doubt could stop me, and the page unfolded into a long, detailed account that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. Marisol wrote about her time in a Seattle marketing firm where she had been gradually isolated from team meetings and publicly undermined until she questioned her own competence. Each paragraph peeled back another layer of a pattern that echoed too closely the quiet violence I once endured inside my own home. She described whispered comments, stolen credit, fabricated rumors, and subtle shifts in workplace dynamics designed to make her doubt herself. It was the kind of cruelty that left no bruises yet carved its own wounds under the skin, the kind people dismiss because they cannot see blood. Still, none of it explained why I was named in a legal case that should have belonged only to her until I reached the final section, a short paragraph with a line that seemed to pierce through 21 years of silence and land directly inside my throat. Ask his sister what he did when she could not breathe. The words pulled the breath from my lungs in a single silent gasp, and I sat motionless, staring at the screen as if the past had reached out with an icy hand, wrapping its fingers around my ribs. My stomach dropped, and for a moment the room felt too small and too bright, the familiar sensation of shrinking air pressing against my chest. I closed my eyes, but the sentence burned behind my eyelids, carrying the echo of that winter night and the desperate scrape of my nails across the living room carpet. How could Marisol know about the asthma attack and the inhaler clutched in Ben's hand as he laughed? No one outside my family had ever known the details. No one except the ER doctor and the nurse who admitted me that night, and neither of them would have recognized me decades later or connected my name to any random workplace complaint. I searched again this time with more urgency, typing her name alongside phrases from the blog entry and court documents related to the lawsuit she filed. The more I read, the clearer it became that Marisol had not simply witnessed ordinary workplace cruelty, but a calculated pattern of psychological assault, the kind of behavior I knew too well, because it was the same pattern Ben had perfected long before he ever stepped into a professional office. The details she described matched the same tendencies he once used on me, escalating from subtle jabs to outright domination the moment he sensed even the slightest power imbalance. A strange mixture of fear and recognition rippled through me. Someone else had suffered at his hands, someone who saw past the charming exterior he used to manipulate everyone around him. But what unsettled me most was that she had somehow traced the cruelty back to its origin and found me buried beneath years of silence. I reread the line over and over, wondering if she meant it literally or figuratively, or if she had simply guessed that the cruelty she encountered had roots somewhere deeper. The possibility that she knew the truth felt impossible, yet here it was, in plain black text, a clue that someone outside my family had glimpsed a story I had spent years trying not to revisit. I leaned back in my chair as the rain thickened against the window, and Maple curled at my feet, sensing my rising unease. The memory of the ER lights and the doctor's voice blurred with the present moment until it felt like two timelines overlapped, breathing in uneven rhythm. I clicked on a second link that opened a legal summary of the complaint Marisol had filed. Her attorney described a consistent pattern of intimidation, psychological manipulation, and retaliatory behavior by her supervisor, identified as Benjamin Collins. Scrolling further, I found excerpts of statements gathered from former coworkers who had left the company quietly because they did not want to challenge a man who wielded fear with practiced ease. But none of them mentioned me. None of them referenced that winter night. Only Marisol did, and she did so with precision sharp enough to slice open the past I had stitched shut. I sat frozen, reading her paragraph once more, feeling the air thicken around me with the old familiar heaviness. She wrote that Ben's cruelty did not begin in the workplace, but had roots that stretched back into his family history, and she urged anyone reading to look deeper if they wanted to understand the harm he was capable of causing. Why would she say that? What did she know? The fear inside me contorted into something else. Not anger exactly, but a sharp alertness, the sense that the universe was placing a choice in front of me. I could ignore the subpoena, pretend the past belonged only to me, and allow Marisol to stand alone against a man who had destroyed more lives than mine. Or I could finally confront the story that shaped me in ways I still carried each time a patient's breath faltered in my hands. I closed the laptop, slowly feeling a tremor ripple through my shoulders, but beneath it there was a steadier voice, one that whispered that silence was a luxury I no longer had. That line in her blog was not an accusation, it was a plea. She was calling for the truth to step out of the shadows because someone else was suffocating now in the same darkness I had once known. And whether I wanted to admit it or not, she had been right to invoke me. Ask his sister what he did when she could not breathe. She was asking me to speak. She was asking me to remember. And I knew then that I could not turn away. The day after reading Marisol's blog, I found myself walking through the hospital halls with a strange tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with asthma and everything to do with the name that kept ringing through my mind like a warning bell. Between checking ventilator settings and updating charts, I kept wondering how much of the man Ben had become resembled the boy who once held my inhaler hostage and laughed while I fought for air. For years, I assumed that leaving home meant leaving him behind, but cruelty is not something people outgrow simply because adolescence ends. It adapts and finds new arenas to thrive in. That thought echoed inside me as I sat in the staff lounge during my break and began searching for information about his adult life. I expected little, but the results poured in more quickly than I was prepared for. The first listing was a company directory identifying him as a regional manager for a large logistics corporation headquartered in Tacoma. His profile photo showed the same calculated smile he had worn as a teenager, a smile that never reached his eyes. The brief bio praised his initiative, strong leadership, and remarkable ability to motivate teams. Yet the praise struck me as hollow because I knew the difference between genuine leadership and intimidation disguised as confidence. I clicked through more links, opening social media pages, corporate event photos, and news blurbs. The pattern was immediate. Coworkers consistently described him as charismatic and ambitious, yet beneath every flattering post were subtle hints of fear and forced admiration. Words like demanding, intense, and uncompromising appeared often enough to form their own shadow narrative. I dug deeper, reading anonymous employee reviews that were far more honest than public praise. One review said that working under Ben felt like walking across thin ice every day, wondering which step would trigger his temper. Another described sudden mood swings and private tirades that left staff shaken. A third said he manipulated people into distrusting each other, then used the chaos to justify firings or demotions. The more I read, the colder I felt because these behaviors were painfully familiar. He had done the same thing to me long before he discovered a corporate setting that rewarded dominance as long as the numbers looked good. I stared at my reflection in the black computer screen between searches and wondered how many people had been hurt while I tried to build a life far from him. There was no guilt in that thought, only recognition that silence sometimes holds a cost we do not see until others pay it. I scrolled through articles mentioning internal disputes, complaints filed quietly without public attention, and closed investigations that seemed to vanish before reaching any form of disciplinary action. I remembered how easily Ben had manipulated adults when we were young, twisting stories just enough to shift blame toward me, or paint himself as the victim of unfair scrutiny. He had perfected that skill by the time he reached adulthood, and seeing it applied professionally made my skin crawl. On my lunch break, I stepped outside into the cool Seattle air and leaned against a stone pillar trying to steady the rush of thoughts. My breaths came fast, but not from panic. It was something closer to clarity. The pattern Marisol described was not new. Ben had built his entire identity around the ability to dominate those who seemed weaker or less protected, and workplaces were full of people who could not afford to push back. That was the difference between us. I had been a child. They were adults who risked their jobs. Either way, the cruelty was the same. My phone buzzed, and for a moment I considered ignoring it until I saw the number listed. It was Marisol's attorney. I answered cautiously, and he introduced himself with a calm, steady tone that gave the impression he had guided many people through storms like this. He explained that they were building a case not just around workplace misconduct, but around a long-standing behavioral pattern suggesting sustained psychological harm inflicted by someone in a position of authority. He said that during their preliminary investigation, they uncovered references to Ben's past, including hints of a serious incident involving a sibling. I felt my breath hitch, but forced it steady because if I remained silent now, I would be helping Ben hide what he had done not only to me, but to others. The attorney asked if I was willing to discuss the events of my childhood and said my account could help demonstrate that the cruelty Marisol endured was not an isolated event but part of a long-established pattern. I told him I needed time, which was true, but what I did not say was that I had spent decades trying to convince myself that my brother's cruelty began and ended within the walls of our childhood home. Now I understood that it had never stayed contained. After the call, I returned to the lounge and stared at the subpoena again, feeling the weight of it shift. It was no longer just a legal demand. It was evidence that someone finally saw what I had once been forced to survive alone. I opened my laptop again, scrolling through more information about Ben, and found an interview he had given to a business magazine where he spoke about discipline, perseverance, and the importance of pushing people to their limits. The interviewer praised his results-driven approach while he smiled confidently at the camera. I saw something else in his expression, something sharp and dangerously familiar. I looked away from the screen, feeling a faint tremor run through me that was not fear but determination. For years, I told myself that the best thing I could do was forget the past, then build something better than the childhood I escaped. But forgetting did not erase what happened, and it did not protect anyone else from Ben's reach. I realized then that the question was no longer whether I wanted to testify. It was whether I could live with myself if I refused. Later that evening, as Maple slept on my lap, I reread the final line of the blog post one more time, letting the words settle deeper than before. Ask his sister what he did when she could not breathe. She was not exposing me. She was inviting me to reclaim something I lost on a winter night in Wisconsin. My voice. If stepping into that courtroom could stop him from suffocating someone else, then maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to breathe again on my own terms. I drove home that evening with the city lights blurring through the windshield, as if the world outside were shifting in slow motion, while my thoughts raced far faster than the traffic around me. By the time I pulled into my parking garage, a single name had surfaced repeatedly in my mind like a buoy rising through dark water. Nora Lang. We had been inseparable once, two quiet girls who found solace in shared corners of the school cafeteria and long walks home, where we traded secrets we never told anyone else. She was the only person who ever noticed that I carried two inhalers, one in my bag and one tucked inside my jacket, because experience taught me that having just one sometimes felt like gambling with my own life. Nora never asked why not directly, but she watched everything with an attentiveness that always made me feel seen in a way my family never had. After graduation, she went on to study computer engineering, then specialized in digital forensics, a field she once claimed felt like detective work for ghosts. I had not spoken to her in nearly 15 years, not out of conflict, but because silence felt easier than dragging old pain into new chapters. Yet, as I stood in my kitchen, staring at the glowing city outside my window, I realized that if anyone held remnants of the girl I used to be, it might be her. The thought made me reach for my phone before hesitation could root me in place. Her number was still saved, though I had no memory of transferring it across the years of changing devices. My thumb hovered above the call button while my pulse thudded softly in my ears. Reconnecting with someone from that time felt like opening a door I had nailed shut. But something deeper urged me forward. I pressed the call icon and held my breath as the line rang. On the third ring, a familiar yet older voice answered cautiously. Avery. For a moment, I could not speak because hearing my name spoken with that mixture of surprise and warmth loosened something inside my chest that had been locked tight for decades. I finally managed hello, and she let out a soft laugh that sounded like relief. "I thought I might never hear from you again," she said, and I felt that old ease settle between us like no time had passed at all. I asked if we could meet, and her tone shifted instantly from gentle nostalgia to quiet seriousness. "Of course," she said. "Do you need help?" The question struck deeper than I expected, and I found myself admitting more than I planned. "I think someone dug up part of my past, and I do not know how." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice held an undertone of conviction. "Then come by my place tonight. I think I might have something too." Half an hour later, I stood outside her small brick townhouse not far from the university district. The porch light flickered softly, and as the door opened, Nora appeared exactly as I remembered, yet changed in ways that mirrored my own adulthood. Her hair was shorter, her frame slightly tense, as though burdened by the kind of empathy that comes from spending years looking into other people's digital tragedies. But her eyes were the same steady, observant, and warm. She pulled me into a brief hug, then stepped back, studying my face with an intensity that made me want to look away. "You have not been sleeping," she said, and it was not a question. I followed her inside, where the living room was scattered with computer parts, external drives, and stacks of labeled evidence bags from her various cases. It felt like stepping into the workspace of someone who pieced together truth for a living. Someone who could resurrect moments people thought they had erased. She motioned for me to sit, then returned with 2 mugs of tea. When she finally spoke, her tone was gentle but direct. "You are here because of Ben, aren't you?" The words struck like a chord vibrating through the air between us. I nodded and told her everything I had learned about the lawsuit, Marisol's blog, the subpoena, and the haunting line that referenced my childhood. All the while, she listened with the stillness of someone gathering threads she had been waiting years to weave together. When I finished, she exhaled slowly, setting her mug down with a faint clink. "Avery," she said, "there is something I kept because I knew one day you might need it." She crossed the room to a small cabinet and retrieved a dust-covered shoebox. My pulse quickened as she set it in front of me, her hands lingering on the lid as though the box itself carried weight. "Before you left for college, I found this in my parents' attic," she said. "I think your family meant to throw it out." I hesitated, then lifted the lid, revealing a stack of old tapes still in their plastic sleeves. A familiar sense of dread seeped through me because I recognized the handwriting scrawled across one label. My mother's. "Family dinner. Summer '05. My breath faltered as memories stirred ones I had spent years pushing away. At the bottom of the box lay a camcorder, small and outdated, but still intact. I felt a tremor in my hands. "How long have you had this?" She met my eyes. "Since we were 18. I tried to give it to you the week before you moved, but you were so focused on leaving that I did not want to drag you back into it. So I kept it. Just in case." Something inside me cracked, then not painfully, but with the sensation of long, frozen emotion beginning to thaw. We set up her equipment, and she connected the camcorder to a digital converter with practiced precision. When the screen flickered to life, the room seemed to fall silent except for the faint hum of her computer. The footage opened on a family barbecue in our backyard, the camera shaky at first, then steadier as someone set it on a table. My parents moved in and out of the frame, hosting laughing performing the ritual of domestic normalcy they worked hard to maintain in public. Then the camera angle shifted, and suddenly Ben was there, 17 years old, towering slightly above me with that familiar look of superiority. The audio crackled, then grew clearer. "Stop being dramatic," he said. "Just breathe. You are so annoying." I watched younger me shrink a little, shoulders tightening as though preparing for impact. In the background, my mother's voice floated thinly. "Leave her alone, Ben." But she said it without conviction, without turning her head. Then came a moment I remembered but had never seen from the outside. Ben snatched my inhaler from my hand and tossed it lazily in the air, laughing while I reached for it desperately. My stomach twisted as I watched the scene play out, the cruelty unmistakable, even through the grainy footage. Yet it was what came next that made Nora lean forward, her eyes narrowing. In the corner of the frame, reflected faintly in the sliding glass door, was my father speaking in a low, urgent voice to my mother. "We have to update the will," he whispered. "Eleanor wants Avery to manage the education fund, but she is too fragile. We need to convince her Avery is not reliable." My mother nodded without hesitation, replying that she had already begun laying the groundwork. The video played on, but I could not hear the rest through the pounding in my ears. My breath shortened, but not from panic. It was something colder, something sharper. Proof. Nora paused the footage and turned to me, her expression both gentle and fierce. "Avery," she whispered, "this is not just evidence of cruelty. This is evidence of intent." I felt my throat tighten as the weight of what we had uncovered settled over me. For the first time in years, I realized the past had not been a series of isolated cruelties, but a deliberate architecture built to erase me from a future I was meant to inherit. The room felt both too small and impossibly vast, as my heartbeat steadied into something new, not fear, but resolve. "They tried to bury you," Nora said softly, "but they left shovels everywhere." I looked at the frozen frame on the screen, at my brother's smirk, at my parents' silhouettes plotting in the reflection, and I felt a slow rising certainty take hold inside me. The past was no longer just memory, it was evidence, and now that it had surfaced, I could no longer walk away. Nora did not speak for several seconds after the paused footage settled into stillness on the screen, and I found myself staring at the frozen image as though the girl captured inside it were someone else entirely. Someone I barely remembered, but still carried inside my ribs like an unfinished sentence. The room seemed to tighten around us with the hum of her equipment filling the silence, and my heartbeat ticking loud enough to feel against my palms. Finally, she exhaled a long, measured breath and said, "There is more on these tapes, Avery. A lot more." I felt the floor shift beneath me in a way that was not physical, but deeply internal, a loosening of memories I had locked away so thoroughly that even the suggestion of their reappearance made my breath catch. Nora reached for another tape, her fingers brushing dust from the label before sliding it into the converter. This one had no writing on it, only an indent where someone had pressed a pen too hard, as though they started labeling the tape and changed their mind. When the video appeared, it opened not on faces, but on darkness. Then, a sudden burst of shaky movement as the camera was lifted and pointed toward the hallway of my childhood home. I recognized the creak of the floorboards long before I recognized the wallpaper, and my body tensed in instinctive anticipation of something I could not yet see. The camera adjusted abruptly and captured a scene I remembered with unsettling clarity, even though I had never seen it from this angle. I was 16, my hair pulled into a messy braid, my inhaler clutched in my hand as I argued with Ben near the foot of the stairs. Except the word argued felt wrong because I was not arguing. I was pleading quietly, trying to retrieve my inhaler from his grasp while he held it up with mocking ease. "Come on, Avery," he taunted. "You should really learn how to take a joke." My younger self said something barely audible, but the tension in my shoulders, the shrinking posture, the quiet desperation were unmistakable. I remembered this moment, how my chest tightened not from asthma, but from humiliation. On the tape, my mother's voice drifted from the next room, sharp and annoyed, telling me to stop overreacting and telling Ben to give me a minute to calm down, as though the inhaler in his hand were not necessary for my lungs to function. The camera panned briefly, and Nora froze the frame. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the reflection in the glass cabinet near the staircase. The reflection showed my father sitting at the dining table, hunched slightly as he thumbed through a stack of papers, while my mother stood beside him, gesturing toward one of the pages. The camera's angle was just wide enough to capture part of the conversation through faint but decipherable audio. "We need to finalize the trust update before Eleanor visits again," my father said. "She still thinks Avery should be involved." My mother's reply was sharper. "That cannot happen. She is too fragile, too emotional. We cannot risk her influencing any decisions." My father nodded with the expression of someone settling a minor logistical matter. "It is already halfway done," he murmured. "Eleanor will not know a thing." The reflection blurred as Ben stepped forward, blocking the view. On the tape, he shoved my shoulder lightly, as though demonstrating his dominance for the unseen camera person. "Stop being dramatic," he said again deliberately, echoing my mother's earlier tone, while my younger self tried to mask the hurt scarring her face. Nora let out a breath, heavy with both anger and pity. They were recording over something she said quietly. This was never meant to be saved. I felt my stomach twist because she was right. If the tape contained moments damaging to them, then its survival was either negligence or fate, and neither possibility brought comfort. She played the video again, and this time it jumped forward abruptly with a slice of static before resettling in a different room. The living room. My breath faltered as I recognized the layout, the worn couch, the coffee table, the lamp whose shade leaned slightly to one side because it had never been screwed on properly. The camera sat on a shelf, capturing a wider angle of the room, as if someone had set it down quickly or forgotten it was running. I saw my 17-year-old self sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading a school assignment. It was one of the rare evenings when my asthma had been calm, the kind where I believed I could simply exist without needing to defend my breathing. Then Ben entered the frame. He walked behind me, tapped my shoulder, and when I turned, he snatched the inhaler from my lap with effortless cruelty. I stiffened in my seat now, watching the recording, and felt my lungs tighten with sympathetic memory. On screen, my younger self stood abruptly reaching for the inhaler while Ben laughed, lifting it above his head like a trophy. "Give it back!" I heard my younger voice crack slightly, betraying fear. "Why do you always make everything so dramatic?" he said, echoing the same refrain he weaponized whenever he wanted to undermine my reality. As the struggle intensified, the camera angle caught another reflection, this time in the dark glass of the television. My parents stood in the hallway watching. Not intervening, not speaking, simply observing as though the unfolding cruelty were mundane background noise in their evening routine. Nora paused the footage again, and her expression hardened into something fierce and protective. "They were complicit," she said softly. "They let it happen. They benefited from it." She fast-forwarded, and the footage cut to another scene, one I had never witnessed even as memory. This time, Ben stood alone in the living room talking to someone behind the camera. "You know they are rewriting the will, right?" he said. "Mom wants everything clean. No loose ends. No Avery coming back later and demanding a piece she never earned." My breath stilled. My chest tightened in a way distinct from asthma, something deeper, heavier, older. On the tape, Ben smirked. "Honestly," he continued, "if she is not around in the long run, things are easier." The recording crackled, then ended abruptly, leaving a hollow quiet in Nora's living room. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The air felt too still, as though the room itself held its breath, waiting for me to absorb what I had just witnessed. Avery. Nora whispered they documented everything without realizing it. This is not a collection of accidents. This is a timeline of intent. My pulse hammered against my throat as I stared at the blank screen. 21 years of memories collapsed into a single, unifying truth. I had not been dramatic. I had not been fragile. I had not misremembered or exaggerated. They had built a world designed to erase me, and now their own forgotten footage revealed the architecture of that cruelty. I placed both hands on the table to steady myself. For the first time, I felt something inside me shift from fear into purpose, a quiet, steady flame that refused to flicker out. The camera had been an accidental witness, but now it was evidence, and evidence changed everything. Nora waited until my breathing steadied before reaching for the shoebox again, as though she sensed the next truth needed to land only after the previous one had settled into my bones. She pushed aside a few old tapes and lifted a thin, worn leather journal from the bottom of the box. The cover was cracked along the spine, soft at the edges, the way paper becomes when it has been touched often with care. The moment I saw it, something inside me lurched because I recognized the handwriting embossed faintly on the corner. Eleanor Collins, my grandmother. I had not seen her handwriting in more than 2 decades yet. The looping curves of her E, the careful spacing between letters jolted through me with a warmth I was not prepared for. I reached for the journal with trembling hands, but paused when a faint scent of lavender rose from the pages, the same perfume she used to dab on her wrists before visiting us on Sunday afternoons. The memory struck with a force that almost unbalanced me. I whispered, I thought everything of hers was thrown out. Nora shook her head. Not everything. This was in one of the boxes your mother donated to the church. Someone dropped it at a rummage sale where my aunt volunteers. She recognized the name and kept it for you. I opened the journal slowly as though afraid the ink might scatter if touched too quickly. The first page was dated 15 years before her death. My dear Avery, if you are reading this, then something has gone very wrong or very right. I hope it is the latter, but I fear it may be the former. My throat tightened instantly. My grandmother had always been gentle with me, always noticing things no one else cared to see, like the way I struggled to finish a full breath on humid days, or how my hands shook after a confrontation with Ben. She would pull me aside, rub my back lightly, and whisper, I see you, sweetheart. I always see you. I turned to the next entry written after a visit to our home. July 10th. Avery looked tired today. She tried to hide it, but I know that look. Patricia kept insisting she was overly sensitive. I know better. Something is wrong in that house. A chill ran through me. I flipped again. September 3rd. Tried calling Avery twice this week. No answer. Patricia told me Avery is becoming distant and dramatic. That does not sound like my girl. I will try again tomorrow. My hands shook. I pressed my thumb against the indentation of her pen strokes as though I might feel her heartbeat there. November 12th. Avery hugged me today and would not let go for several seconds. When I asked if something was on her mind, she said nothing, but her eyes said everything. Patricia interrupted us before she could speak. I do not like this. They are keeping her from me. My breath hitched because I remembered that day vividly. I remembered leaning into my grandmother because she smelled like cinnamon and warmth and safety. I remembered opening my mouth to tell her that Ben had taken my inhaler again, that my father told me to toughen up, that my mother sighed whenever I asked for help. And I remembered my mother's hand gripping my shoulder, pulling me back with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. I kept reading. January 8th. Eleanor's handwriting had grown firmer here as if conviction sharpened every letter. If anything happens to me, Avery needs access to the Family Education Fund. She is the only one who will use it responsibly. Ben is too reckless, and Patricia encourages him. I will speak to the attorney next month. The page after that was slightly crumpled. The entry, dated only a few days later, sent a cold tremor through my spine. January 14th. Patricia visited unexpectedly today. She insisted I was confusing dates and conversations. She tried to convince me that Avery was unstable and untrustworthy. I did not believe her, but I worry. They want to cut Avery out of the trust. I will not allow it. I paused, letting the words burn into me like truth written in flame. My grandmother had fought for me long before I ever knew there was a battle. Nora leaned forward, her voice soft. Keep reading. I turned the page. February 2nd. Called Avery again. No answer. Patricia said she was out with friends. I doubt it. That girl never lies. Someone is lying to me. Someone is blocking my messages. Rage flared hot inside my chest because I knew now what I could not prove then. My mother had deleted every voicemail. She had intercepted every letter. She had built a wall around me so no one could see the truth. I kept reading. March 10th. Something is happening behind my back. Documents in my desk were moved. The page with Avery's name circled in my trust folder is missing. I fear Patricia and Ben are trying to influence my decisions. Avery deserves every opportunity. She is bright, gentle, capable. Why can they not see that? A tear dropped onto the page, blurring part of the ink. I wiped my eyes quickly, afraid of smearing her words further. April 19th. I tried visiting Avery today. Patricia said she was too sick to come downstairs. I waited an hour, then left. Later I learned she was never told I came by. My stomach dropped. I remembered that day. I remembered hearing the doorbell and wanting to go down, but my mother blocked the staircase, saying I looked too tired. I thought she was protecting me. She was not. The next entry came weeks later and was written with a shaky hand. June 5th. I am updating my will this month. Avery must remain in the plans. If this journal is ever found by her, it means that I failed to protect her while alive. But perhaps words can protect what I could not. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Nora rested a hand on my shoulder, letting me take as long as I needed before I turned to the final entry written shortly before her death. July 12th. My sweet Avery, if you find this one day, I want you to know something. You were never difficult. You were never fragile. You were never a disappointment. You were a child trying to breathe in a house that did not know how to love you. I saw you. I always saw you, and I fought for you until my last breath. My hand covered my mouth, but the sob escaped anyway, raw and broken and years overdue. Nora closed the journal gently and pulled me into a loose embrace, giving me space to both fall apart and remain upright. For several minutes, all I could do was hold the journal against my chest, feeling the imprint of my grandmother's love burn through the leather like a steady flame. When I finally spoke, my voice came out thin but certain. She knew. She always knew. Nora nodded. And she left you proof, Avery. Proof they cannot erase. I looked at the journal again, understanding with new clarity that this was not just memory. It was testimony from the only person who ever truly saw me. And now, her voice would finally be heard. The journal stayed on my lap long after Nora's words faded into quiet, and I ran my fingers along its frayed spine, feeling as if my grandmother herself were guiding my hand, reminding me that truth was not meant to be buried even when people spent years shoveling dirt on top of it. When I finally rose to leave, Nora walked me to the door, pressing a small flash drive into my palm. "All the footage is on here," she said, "and the journal scans. Keep them somewhere safe." Her voice lowered with an edge of certainty. "They are going to matter more than you think." Outside, the air carried a crispness that felt almost cleansing, though the weight in my chest had only grown heavier. I clutched the flash drive tight as I walked to my car, sensing that my life had split into a before and after the moment I pressed play on that camcorder. For the first time in years, the past no longer felt like a vague shadow, but a living shape rising with unmistakable clarity. When I arrived home, Maple greeted me with a faint chirp weaving around my ankles, unaware that the world had shifted its axis beneath my feet. I set the journal on my kitchen island and rested both hands beside it, steadying myself as a flicker of anger sharpened into something colder and more focused. What they did was deliberate. What they hid was calculated. What they took was mine. And yet another thought pulsed beneath the anger. Someone out there needed me to speak now. Someone who had already suffered at the hands of the same man who once smiled while holding my breath hostage. As if summoned by that realization, my phone rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number from Tacoma. For a second, fear pulled at my ribs tight and familiar, but then resolve followed. I answered. A woman's voice came first, crisp, professional, warm in tone, but weighted with purpose. "Avery Collins, this is attorney Dana Willis. I represent Marisol Green in the case against your brother." I froze but kept the phone pressed to my ear. "Yes," I said, though the word felt smaller than I intended. She continued, "I understand this is difficult for you, and I want to be clear that we are not asking you to relive trauma without support. but we believe your testimony could provide a crucial foundation for demonstrating a long-standing behavioral pattern. I leaned against the counter as my breath steadied. You think he has done this before? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Dana paused as if weighing how much truth to reveal. There have been multiple reports, she said finally. Internal complaints, anonymous HR submissions. Several employees quit without explanation. Marisol is the first person who documented everything and pushed back. My jaw tightened. What exactly does her case involve? Dana cleared her throat. Workplace psychological abuse, harassment, retaliation, and coercion. In simple terms, intimidation tactics that undermine safety and well-being. It matched exactly who he had always been. Dana continued. We also uncovered information suggesting that your brother has a long history of targeting people he perceives as vulnerable, especially when he feels he can manipulate power dynamics. Her voice softened but carried a pointed undercurrent. That history appears to include you. My breath stilled. There was no gentler way to say it. I asked quietly, How did Marisol know about me? There was a small pause. Her grandmother and your grandmother were lifelong friends, Dana explained. When Marisol began speaking out, her grandmother shared things she remembered from conversations with Eleanor. Your grandmother suspected something was wrong. She just never had proof. Until now. My throat tightened at the mention of Eleanor. I glanced toward the journal lying open on the counter, its pages lit softly by the kitchen lamp. Dana's voice returned steady, patient. We are not asking you to do this alone. We can meet in person, go through every detail slowly. You will decide what you are ready to share. But your perspective could be pivotal, because courts take patterns seriously. Patterns show intent. Patterns reveal what isolated incidents hide. I pressed my hand against my sternum, grounding myself as I asked the question I was afraid of. What would testifying mean for me? She did not sugarcoat it. It means facing him again. It means revisiting things he and your parents worked hard to erase. It means the possibility of your testimony becoming part of public record. But it also means protecting future victims who may never come forward. It means taking back your narrative. Silence filled the line while I tried to steady my breathing. The Avery who nearly died on a living room floor would have curled into herself, believing her voice had no power against the people who stole it. But that Avery had grown into someone who saved lives daily, someone who guided patients through their own breathless terror, someone who understood the cost of silence when oxygen slipped away. I made myself ask, What do you need from me? Dana did not hesitate. Documentation if you have it. A statement about the incident when you were 17. Anything that establishes a pattern of cruelty. My fingers drifted over the journal again, tracing the line my grandmother wrote. You were never a disappointment. You were a child trying to breathe in a house that did not know how to love you. My voice steadied. I have evidence, a journal. Videos, footage they did not know existed. Dana exhaled audibly. Then, Avery, she said softly. This changes everything. We set up a time to meet later that week. After I hung up the phone, I stood in the stillness of my apartment, hearing my own pulse in my ears. For the first time, the fear did not feel like drowning. It felt like momentum. It felt like standing at the threshold of something I could no longer avoid. I picked up the journal, gently opened to the last page, and whispered into the empty kitchen. I am ready. For the first time in my life, the words felt true and solid and entirely mine. The game was no longer theirs to control. The beginning of the end had just been set in motion. The morning of the hearing arrived with a gray heaviness that seemed to settle over Seattle like a second sky, and for a long moment I sat on the edge of my bed, feeling the weight of 15 years collapse into the small space between my ribs. I had imagined this day 1,000 different ways over the years, first as something impossible, then as something I would run from, and finally as something I would face only when I had no choice. But now that it had come, I felt an unexpected steadiness rising beneath the nerves, a quiet pulse that reminded me I had already survived the worst thing my family ever did to me. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple navy blouse and black slacks, the kind of outfit that conveyed professionalism without pretense. Maple circled my feet, sensing the shift in my energy, and I knelt to stroke her fur, letting the soft vibration of her purr ground me before stepping into the day. The courthouse stood tall and severe against the muted skyline, and as I approached its steps, the air felt colder, sharper, like a breath held between two moments. In the lobby, the security line moved quickly, but my pulse thudded with steady insistence as each step drew me closer to the courtroom where my past waited. Dana met me near the elevator, offering a reassuring nod. "You are not alone," she said quietly. "Remember that." I held on to her words as we walked down the hallway toward the courtroom doors, and for a brief second I paused, my hand resting on the cool metal handle. The breath I drew was steady, though the tremor beneath it reminded me that the girl inside me still feared the shadows that bore her name. When I entered the courtroom, the world narrowed. Ben sat at the plaintiff's table in a well-tailored suit, his posture straight, his expression carefully composed into an air of confident irritation, as though the entire proceeding were an inconvenience meant to disrupt his schedule, not his life. His hair was shorter than I remembered, and there was new sharpness around his jaw, but the expression in his eyes had not changed at all. That same glint of superiority, that same coldness, that same subtle smile that said he feared nothing because he believed no one could ever hold him accountable. When he saw me, his smile widened into something that made my stomach twist. "Well, if it is not little Avery," he murmured loud enough for me to hear. "Still chasing sympathy, I see." The words struck like a familiar blow, but they did not land the way he intended. Instead of shrinking, I felt something inside me go still and cold like a lake freezing over. I met his gaze evenly, and his smile faltered just a fraction. My parents sat in the row behind him. My mother's appearance startled me not because she had aged, but because she had not tried to hide it. The woman who once refused to leave the house without perfect hair and pressed clothes now looked worn around the edges, her expression tugged into tight lines of annoyance and fatigue. She crossed her arms when she saw me, her mouth tightening, as though the sight of me were an inconvenience she wished she could swat away. My father avoided my eyes entirely, studying a spot on the floor with practiced detachment, the same detachment he used on the night I collapsed, gasping for air while he kept watching television. Dana leaned close to me. "Remember what we practiced. Look at them only when you choose to, not when they demand your attention." I nodded, stepping toward the defense table. As we waited for the judge to enter the room, the quiet murmur of conversations filled the space, yet none of it penetrated the thick shell of awareness that had wrapped around me. The last time I had been in the same room as my family 15 years ago, my breathing tightened whenever they looked at me, always waiting for the next criticism, the next dismissal, the next reminder that I did not belong among them. Now the air did not feel suffocating. It felt clear. Judge Harwood entered an older woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her presence alone shifted the energy of the room, and for a moment even Ben's posture stiffened as she addressed the court. As proceedings began, the attorneys reviewed the schedule and evidence lists, and I felt my heartbeat rise with each passing moment, knowing the confrontation I had avoided for years was about to unfold. During a brief recess before witness examinations, my mother finally stood and walked toward me, her heels tapping sharply against the floor as though each step carried a reprimand. "Avery," she said curtly, "I hope you are not planning to make this more dramatic than it needs to be." Her tone was the same one she used whenever she wanted to guilt me back into silence. I watched her face closely, the controlled expression, the faint irritation, the refusal to acknowledge harm. Instead of responding, I asked a question that made her flinch. "Did you know I almost died?" She scoffed, lightly waving her hand. "You always exaggerate. Even then the doctors said you were fine after a few hours." I felt my jaw tighten. "I was unconscious," I said. "For 3 hours," she rolled her eyes. "Honestly, Avery, if you had been less sensitive growing up, none of this would be happening." I opened my mouth to speak, but Dana stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "Let her go," she murmured. "You do not owe her anything." My mother's gaze hardened when she saw the journal in my other hand, and a flash of something sharp and fearful crossed her face. Before she could speak further, Ben approached, towering over us. "You always needed an audience," he sneered at me. "Even when you were a kid. always gasping for attention. The word gasping landed like a hook, dragging memories across my skin, but the fear that once accompanied it did not rise. Instead, I heard my voice steady itself. The only thing I gasped for was air. And you laughed. His expression cracked for a second, revealing a flicker of unease before he masked it with a dismissive scoff. Whatever, you never could handle anything. No wonder they always had to pick up after you. Not anymore, I said quietly, and the simplicity of the words seemed to unnerve him more than anger would have. The bailiff called us back into the courtroom, and as I took my seat, the weight of 15 years settled not on my shoulders, but behind me where it belonged. I was not that girl anymore, suffocating in silence. I was a woman standing in a room where truth finally had a voice. And for the first time since I was 17, I breathed without apology. When the bailiff called the courtroom back to order, a charged stillness settled over the room, the kind that makes every small sound feel louder than it should, and every breath feel like it carries weight. I sat beside Dana as Judge Harwood took her seat again, and the low hum of whispered conversations dissolved into silence. The tension was immediate and suffocating, yet somehow clarifying, as though the air itself demanded honesty. The judge reviewed a few procedural notes, then turned her attention to the attorneys, signaling that witness testimony and evidentiary presentation would begin. My pulse beat hard against my throat, but I kept my gaze steady the way Dana had taught me. Do not shrink. Do not flinch. Let the truth stand taller than your fear. The plaintiff's attorney began first questioning Marisol about her experience working under Ben. Her voice trembled at the beginning, but grew steadier as she recounted the manipulative meetings, the private threats, the subtle humiliations, the way he isolated her from co-workers, and pushed her until her hands shook during basic tasks. Across the room, Ben scoffed under his breath and shook his head as if the entire testimony were an inconvenience crafted solely to annoy him. At one point, he leaned toward his attorney, whispering sharply with an expression of rehearsed outrage. But the more he tried to perform the role of the falsely accused, the more obvious his cracks became. When it was time to introduce supporting evidence, Dana rose with a calm confidence that instantly shifted the room's energy. She approached the bench, her voice even but carrying a quiet force. Your Honor, we request permission to present video documentation recovered from a 2005 family recording. It is relevant to establishing a long-term pattern of psychological cruelty manipulation and reckless disregard for safety. My stomach tightened as the screen was wheeled forward and positioned for viewing. The lights dimmed slightly, and for a moment I felt as though time folded around me, the courtroom dissolving into a shadow of the living room where the recording was first captured. The footage flickered to life, slightly grainy, but still painfully clear. There was Ben on the screen, 17 years old, smirking at the camera as he waved my inhaler in the air just beyond my reach. Come on, Avery, he taunted. Try harder. Behind him, my younger self coughed violently, clutching her chest as desperation contorted her small frame. The room seemed to tilt as the courtroom watched the moment unfold. Someone in the gallery gasped softly. Marisol covered her mouth. Even my mother, a few rows behind Ben, flinched, though she quickly masked it with an irritated sigh. The video continued, capturing my mother in the background, telling me to stop being dramatic, and my father muttering that kids need to toughen up. This is absurd, Ben's attorney objected, scrambling to his feet. This video is ancient, irrelevant, and taken completely out of context. Dana turned toward him with a composure that cut sharper than anger. Out of context, she repeated evenly, is a child wheezing on the floor while her brother mocks her considered context-dependent? The judge raised a hand, silencing the growing tension. The objection is overruled, she said firmly. The footage will remain in evidence. Ben's jaw tightened. He shifted in his seat, shoulders stiffening as though he expected the room to applaud his suffering. But the silence that followed became its own verdict. Next, Dana introduced the second piece of evidence. Your Honor, the defense would like to submit scans of a personal journal belonging to the witness's grandmother, Eleanor Collins. These entries corroborate a pattern of ongoing familial neglect and psychological harm. The judge nodded, and the journal pages appeared on the screen. My grandmother's handwriting curved across the page in soft blue ink, each line a quiet revelation. I fear Avery is being mistreated. She is constantly blamed for things she did not do. When she tries to speak, Ben mocks her until she cries. Her parents dismiss her pain as dramatics. I pray she finds breath somewhere beyond this house. My chest tightened with the ache of recognition. I had lived that truth, but until now, no one had spoken it aloud, not even on paper until her. Ben shifted again this time with a hint of panic beneath the arrogance. He whispered harshly to his attorney, who attempted to mask growing concern. Then came the emails. Dana approached the judge again. Additional evidence, Your Honor. Correspondence between Mr. Collins and his parents discussing strategies for diminishing Ms. Green's credibility, including suggestions to accuse her of paranoia. The courtroom stirred. Dana continued. And finally, emails from Mr. Collins's parents dating back 15 years, revealing their belief that Avery was too weak to handle responsibility and therefore should be kept from future family assets. My mother inhaled sharply as her own words projected across the screen. She is too fragile, emotional, and frankly a liability. We need to rethink things before Mother puts anything in writing. My father had replied. I agree. Avery will only drag the family down. The gallery erupted in whispers, but the judge's gavel brought silence. Looking at those lines laid bare for strangers to judge did not break me. It steadied me. It validated every silent wound, every breath stolen before its time. As the last email faded, the judge addressed the court. These materials demonstrate significant relevance to establishing motive character and behavioral patterns. They will be admitted. A visible crack split through Ben's composure then. His face reddened, his jaw clenched, and he slammed a hand onto the table, startling his own attorney. This is ridiculous, he snapped. None of this proves anything. I was a kid. She was a drama queen. Everyone knows that. His voice rose with panic disguised as indignation. Avery has always exaggerated. She wants attention. She always has. I felt every word like the echo of an old script he had rehearsed for years. But this time, the courtroom did not nod along. This time, the world did not bend to his narrative. Judge Harwood's gaze sharpened as she regarded him. Mr. Collins, you will control your tone in my courtroom. Ben's breath came fast and hard, a mirror of the panic he once delighted in triggering in me. And in that moment, I felt the shift. The courtroom saw him clearly, not as the polished manager, not as the golden boy, but as the cruel boy who grew into a cruel man. A hush settled as the judge called for a brief recess. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my heartbeat steady with a calm I had never known in their presence. The truth was no longer trapped in my lungs. It had been spoken, shown recorded, validated, and for the first time I sensed that the trial was no longer about proving I had suffered. It was about proving he had made others suffer too, and that the world was finally ready to hold him accountable. When the recess ended, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt transformed, charged with a slow, heavy anticipation, as though everyone sensed the trial had reached a precipice. People shifted in their seats, leaning forward subtly, while the judge resumed her place and the attorneys organized their materials once more. Dana stood with measured calm, her presence steady and resolute, and I felt a quiet strength settle in my chest, simply knowing she was the one guiding this final descent into truth. Your Honor, the defense requests permission to introduce one final piece of evidence, she said. This material was recovered recently during the restoration of a family recording and has not been previously viewed by the witness. A murmur rippled across the gallery. Even Ben straightened with a jerk, as if the air had suddenly turned colder. His attorney whispered rapidly, urging him to remain composed, but a tremor of uncertainty flickered beneath his facade. Permission granted, the judge said. Proceed. The lights dimmed once again, and the screen lit up with the familiar grainy timestamp from the camcorder, but this time it displayed footage I had never seen. The view began in the hallway of our old Wisconsin house. The camera accidentally left running as muffled voices drifted in from another room. My younger self could be heard struggling to breathe, faint gasps breaking through the background hum. Then the frame shifted abruptly. Someone must have bumped the table because the camera angled downward, capturing the living room carpet, then the edge of the coffee table, then the lower half of Ben's body as he stepped forward. He was holding my inhaler. His voice came through the speakers with chilling clarity. "You do not need this. You just want attention." 17 years fell away in an instant. The courtroom faded, the present blurred, and for a heartbeat, I was back on that floor, tasting dust and terror, as my throat closed and my lungs tightened like fists squeezing from the inside. The camera captured my small frame, trembling on the carpet, one hand outstretched toward him. Words gasped out of me, though barely audible. "Please." Ben laughed a low, amused sound that echoed across the courtroom with such cruelty that even strangers winced. "You sound pathetic," he said. "Seriously, stop pretending you are dying." The footage shook slightly as he walked closer, and then the moment came, the one I had relived in nightmares but never expected to see with my own eyes again. He pushed me. Not a tap, not a stumble. A deliberate shove that knocked my already weakened body backward. The back of my head hit the floor with a dull sound, and the camera's microphone picked up the soft thud, the gasp that never fully formed the silence that followed. My chest rose once and failed to rise again properly. I went limp. In the footage, Ben froze for half a second, and for the first time there was no smirk on his face, only annoyance quickly masked by irritation. "Oh, great," he muttered. "Seriously, Avery." Then came the voices of my parents. The footage showed their silhouettes entering the room. My mother's voice tight with frustration. "What did she do now?" My father sighed loudly. "Always causing a scene." "She is unconscious," my mother said, but not with urgency, rather with exasperation. Ben shrugged. "She fell. That is all." The three of them stared down at my unmoving body, and the silence that followed was worse than any words. It was the silence of people calculating inconvenience, not danger. Finally, my father muttered, "If we call an ambulance, the neighbors will talk." Then the camera picked up something else, something I had never known. My mother said softly, "Then let us just take her and drop her off." No sirens. No questions. A cold wave of horror swept through the room. Dana let the footage run a moment longer, revealing only the sound of footsteps, the shuffling of hurried decisions, the casual cruelty of people treating a dying girl as an obstacle, not a child. Then she pressed pause. The still frame on the screen showed my unconscious body, pale, motionless, abandoned by the people who should have protected me. A tremble ran through the gallery. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another person covered their mouth. I sat, frozen muscles, rigid breath, trembling uncontrolled as memories collided with undeniable proof. I had always believed no one had truly seen that moment, but the camera had. And now the world had too. The judge leaned forward, her expression hardened, not with anger, but with a grave understanding. "Mr. Collins," she said in a tone that sliced through the room, "do you wish to respond?" Ben shot to his feet, his face-flushed eyes narrowing with wild indignation. "That video is misleading," he sputtered. "She always pretended. She was fine. She was faking it. This is ridiculous. She always wanted attention." The desperation in his voice cracked the shell of arrogance he had maintained all morning. His attorney tugged his sleeve, urging him to sit, but Ben ignored him. "She fell. I did not push her. The camera angle is wrong. The sound is off. She exaggerates everything, everything." He jabbed a finger toward me. "She has always been dramatic. You have no idea what she was like. She caused problems for years." I swallowed hard, steadying myself as Dana gently squeezed my wrist, signaling that I could speak if I wished. Judge Harwood turned to me. "Ms. Collins, would you like to give your statement?" My pulse beat rapidly, but my voice when it emerged was calm and clear. "What you saw is exactly what happened," I said. I could not breathe. I begged for help. He laughed. He pushed me. I hit the floor and everything went black. I looked at my parents, then at Ben. "You left me there. You did not check my pulse. You did not call for help. You did not even want the neighbors to see." A tremor traveled through my fingers, but I did not look away. "You dropped me at the ER like a broken object and drove off. I nearly died. And none of you cared." The judge watched me quietly, her eyes softened by a depth of empathy that threatened to undo me, but I held firm. Dana stepped forward again, her voice resonant. Your Honor, this footage establishes not only negligence but a clear pattern of cruelty and indifference toward a minor in medical distress. Combined with all prior evidence, it demonstrates intent, disregard, and a long-established behavioral pattern relevant to this case. The judge nodded, her expression solemn. The evidence is compelling. Mr. Collins, I strongly advise you to exercise your right to remain silent. Ben opened his mouth again, but his attorney finally yanked him back down, forcing him to sit. The courtroom fell silent as the screen went dark, leaving the imprint of truth hanging in the air, heavy and undeniable. I exhaled slowly, the breath shaking free of 17 years of silence. Everything was now in the open. Everything was seen. Everything was believed. And for the first time since that night, I felt the suffocating weight inside my chest begin to loosen. When the final piece of evidence faded from the screen, the silence inside the courtroom felt almost physical, thick and heavy like the air before a storm. No one shifted, no one whispered, no one even breathed too loudly. It was the kind of silence that follows truth when truth has finally spoken with a force no one can turn away from. Judge Harwood folded her hands atop the bench, her expression unreadable, yet weighted with unmistakable gravity. She looked at the attorneys, then at Ben, then briefly at me, and her eyes held something I had never seen on an authority figure's face when it came to my family. Recognition. She cleared her throat and addressed the room. This court has reviewed all submitted evidence, including video documentation, witness testimony, journal entries, and internal correspondence. The tone of her voice sent a tremor down my spine, not of fear, but of long-awaited vindication. We will now proceed to closing arguments. The plaintiff's attorney rose first, doing his best to project confidence, but the air of certainty he had worn earlier had vanished, replaced by a nervous rigidity in his shoulders. He argued that the video was inconclusive, that childhood incidents were irrelevant, that workplace concerns were exaggerated, and that Ben's leadership style was merely assertive, not abusive. His words fell flat. No one reacted. The evidence had spoken louder than anything he could offer, and every attempt to spin it only made the truth more solid. When Dana approached for her closing argument, she did not raise her voice or posture dramatically. She simply spoke with the calm, deliberate cadence of someone who knew the truth was not fragile and did not need embellishment. Your Honor, this case is not about a single moment in a workplace. It is about a pattern of manipulation, intimidation, and psychological cruelty that spans nearly 2 decades. She gestured lightly toward the blank screen. That footage does not show a childish prank or a misunderstanding. It shows a minor in medical distress and a brother who mocked her suffering. It shows parents who prioritized reputation over their daughter's life. And it shows the origins of a behavioral pattern that continued into his adulthood, culminating in the harm done to Ms. Green. Dana stepped closer to the bench. Patterns matter in cases of psychological abuse. They reveal intent. They reveal a history of disregard for the well-being of others. And they reveal choices Mr. Collins made consistently over many years. Her voice softened but carried an emotional resonance that filled every corner of the room. Ms. Collins survived that night despite every effort made to silence her pain. Today she has chosen to break that silence not for herself but to protect others. She deserves to be believed. And justice requires acknowledgement, not blindness. Dana took her seat, and the judge nodded solemnly. The court will recess briefly while I review the record and prepare a ruling. My heart pounded hard but steady, and I felt a warm weight on my shoulder. It was Nora who had slipped quietly into the courtroom during the recess. She leaned close and whispered, I am right here. You are not doing this alone. When the judge returned, the hush in the room deepened. She adjusted her glasses, glanced down at her notes, then looked directly at Ben. Mr. Collins, please rise. Ben stood reluctantly, jaw clenched, eyes darting between the judge and his attorney as if searching for escape. The ruling of this court is as follows. The judge began. In the matter of Green versus Collins, the evidence overwhelmingly supports the plaintiff's claim of psychological abuse retaliation and a hostile work environment. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Marisol Green. A soft cry escaped Marisol in the gallery. She covered her mouth as relief washed over her face. But the judge was not finished. Furthermore, the court finds reasonable cause to open a separate investigation into the events involving Ms. Avery Collins when she was a minor based on newly recovered evidence. The courtroom rippled with shock. Even I felt my breath catch. This will be referred to Child Protective Services and the state's attorney for review under statutes concerning endangerment of a minor and reckless disregard for medical safety. Ben's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came. His attorney grabbed his arm as if bracing for impact. The judge continued steady, unwavering. This does not constitute a criminal ruling at this time, but the investigation will determine whether civil or criminal action is warranted. Additionally, she looked down at her notes again. The will originally drafted by Eleanor Collins will be reviewed due to compelling evidence suggesting coercion and intentional interference by the decedent's heirs. My mother gasped. My father swore under his breath. Ben looked like the floor beneath him had collapsed. The judge's gaze settled on me, softening just a fraction. Ms. Collins, your testimony and the evidence you provided have been vital to restoring clarity to events long obscured. Your courage is noted by this court. Warmth spread slowly through my chest like thawing ice. For the first time in my life, an adult in authority recognized what had happened, not dismissed it, not excused it, acknowledged it. The judge's voice cut back through the stillness. This court stands adjourned. The sound of the gavel cracked through the room and everything shifted. It felt as though a long, locked door inside me had opened, letting in light I had never been allowed to feel as a child. People rose, papers shuffled, attorneys murmured. But all I saw was Ben. He stared at me with a look I had never seen on his face. Not hatred, not smug superiority, not even anger. Fear. Real fear. He mouthed something, but I could not make it out, and I realized it did not matter. His words had ruled my life for too long. Now they meant nothing. Dana placed a gentle hand on my back, guiding me toward the aisle. Marisol rushed forward, tears streaking her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved me." I shook my head softly. "You saved yourself." I just refused to stay silent. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter, as though the weight of an entire winter had finally lifted off my lungs. And for the first time since I was 17, I inhaled fully freely, without fear of someone laughing at the sound. The collapse of Ben Collins did not happen in a single dramatic instant, but rather in a series of quiet implosions, each one tightening around him like coils that had been waiting years to snap into place. Yet from the outside, it looked sudden, catastrophic, a fall from grace that no one who knew him professionally could have predicted, or so they claimed. In truth, the signs had always been there, buried beneath charm and bluster and perfectly rehearsed confidence. The morning after the ruling, the first headline appeared online. Regional manager accused of long-term psychological abuse loses court battle. A smaller subtitle read, "Video evidence reveals disturbing past incident involving minor." The article spread with wildfire speed, picked up by local news blogs, employee forums, and eventually larger media outlets looking for a scandal with emotional weight. By noon, the hashtag #InhalerBrother began trending. Someone had clipped the frame where teenage Ben held my inhaler above my gasping younger self and posted it on social media with the caption, "This is what a monster looks like when he thinks no one is watching." It hit thousands of shares in an hour, then tens of thousands. Comment sections flooded with outraged disbelief, pity for me, and fury toward him. People said things like, "I hope the sister is okay now, and my brother bullied me too, and this is why victims stay silent." Others wrote more direct condemnation. "Fire him immediately. This guy should never supervise anyone again." I cannot believe he is a grown man who acted like this as a teen and apparently never changed. All the while, I sat in my apartment drinking lukewarm tea, feeling numb and alert, at the same time as if my body had not yet caught up to the reality that the world finally saw him as I always had. By mid-afternoon, a source inside his company leaked a memo. Effective immediately, Ben Collins is placed on administrative leave pending further internal review. Hours later, another update followed. He was officially terminated. His dismissal letter was leaked as well, confirming gross misconduct violation of ethical guidelines and compromising workplace safety. In every corner of the internet, people dissected his downfall. Some called it karma, others called it justice. Others simply said it was long overdue. Meanwhile, Ben tried desperately to salvage his image. He released a shaky video statement filmed in bad lighting where he claimed he was the victim of character assassination and that the footage from years ago was being taken out of context. But his eyes darted too much, his voice wavered, and behind the forced calm anger simmered. Comments under his video were brutal. "We saw the footage, dude. You are done. Stop lying. You terrorized your sister." Another comment read, "My brother abused me too. Watching you deny it makes me sick." Someone else wrote, "This is not a man under attack. This is a man exposed." His fiancée posted her own announcement that same evening. "Effective today, I have ended my engagement with Ben Collins. Recent revelations have brought truths to light that I cannot ignore. I ask for privacy at this time." People screenshot her post everywhere. Many praised her for leaving. Others wondered aloud what she must have endured with him behind closed doors. Then another wave hit. Former employees began posting their own stories. One wrote, "I worked under Ben for 9 months. He once called me incompetent in front of the entire team because I needed an extra day to finish a report." That was the mild version of his abuse. Another said, "He cornered me in a meeting room once and told me I would lose my job if I didn't stop asking questions." Yet, HR always protected him. More employees came forward, each story echoing the same pattern: manipulation, intimidation, humiliation. Their courage created a tidal wave that drowned every attempt he made to defend himself. His public accounts shut down one by one, either deleted or locked private. But screenshots remained everywhere, impossible to erase. The internet never forgets. And the truth once revealed refuses to be buried again. Meanwhile, the state's attorney quietly confirmed that they were reviewing the footage involving my childhood incident. Nothing official was announced, but media outlets buzzed with speculation. Could charges be brought? Would the parents be implicated? What did it mean for the original will left by my grandmother? Through it all, I maintained silence, not because I feared speaking, but because I no longer needed to. The truth existed independently, now living in video forensic reports, testimonies, and court rulings. It no longer depended on my voice alone. Late one evening, Nora came over bringing takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. She sat across from me picking at her noodles while scrolling through her phone. "You should see the comments," she said, raising an eyebrow. "The internet has basically crowned you the symbol of survival." I groaned lightly. "Please do not say that. It sounds dramatic." She smirked. "Avery, you survived your own family trying to erase you. Drama is relative." She tapped her screen again. "Look." Someone posted a side-by-side comparison of teenage you and adult you with the caption, "She learned to breathe on her own terms." My throat tightened unexpectedly. I had not asked for any of this. I had not sought attention or vindication or recognition. I only wanted the truth. The consequences, however, had rippled farther than I ever imagined. As days passed, Ben's world continued to shrink. The company filed a civil claim against him seeking damages for reputational harm. His former fiancée's family demanded he return gifts, money, and assets provided during the engagement. His attorney resigned from the case, citing irreconcilable differences. Rumors spread that he could not leave his apartment without someone shouting "Inhaler Brother" from across a parking lot. The power he once wielded so easily evaporated. The armor of charm cracked. The rehearsed smile faded. The pedestal collapsed. One night, as I sat looking out over the Seattle skyline, reflecting on everything that had unfolded, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. A ragged breath came through the line. "Avery." It was him. Ben. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual confidence. "You ruined my life." I closed my eyes, feeling a calm settle inside me, not cold, not vengeful, simply resolute. "No," I said quietly. "You ruined it yourself." He inhaled sharply as if the truth stung. I opened my grandmother's journal beside me, fingers resting on her handwriting. For years I fought to breathe. Now he was finally gasping, and for the first time I understood something with absolute clarity. Justice is not about revenge. It is about restoration. And my restoration had already begun. The knock on my door came on a gray Saturday morning, the kind where Seattle mist hangs low and everything feels muted, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I was still in pajama bottoms, sipping reheated coffee, when I heard it steady, persistent, not tentative at all. For a moment, my pulse jumped, thinking absurdly that it might be Ben, even though I knew he would not dare face me now. When I opened the door, both my parents stood there on the walkway, looking like faded sketches of themselves, smaller, older, diminished. My mother wore a beige cardigan pulled tightly around her, as if bracing against a cold only she could feel, while my father stood with hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders drawn up, his usual confidence replaced by something closer to shame. "Avery," my mother whispered before I could say a word, as though speaking my name might magically undo 21 years of silence and harm. Her eyes were already red-swollen from crying, though part of me suspected she had cried more for her reputation than for me. She stepped forward, arms half lifted as if expecting I might embrace her, but I remained still, leaning against the door frame blocking the entrance. She froze mid-step, her expression fracturing when she realized I was not moving to close the distance. I waited. I wanted them to speak first. My father cleared his throat, glancing at the ground. "We just want to talk," he said barely above a whisper, the same man who used to bark orders at us now, unable to meet my eyes. My mother rushed in as she always had, filling silence with excuses. "Everything has gotten so out of control," she said, voice trembling. "The video, the news, the things people are saying." She pressed a shaking hand to her chest. "I never meant for your childhood to seem so bad. It was not that bad, Avery. You are remembering it harsher than it was." My jaw tightened. Even now they were rewriting history, gaslighting me in the same gentle, patronizing tone they had used my entire childhood. "Mom," I said slowly, carefully, "I did not remember it harsher. I remembered it exactly." She blinked, stunned, then tried again. "Your brother has been punished enough. We have all suffered. People at church whisper. Our neighbors avoid us." I looked her straight in the eye and for the first time felt nothing but clarity. "You are describing consequences, not suffering." She flinched as if I had slapped her, but I continued. "I spent most of my life thinking I was the problem, thinking I was dramatic, thinking everything was my fault. That is what you taught me." Dad stepped in quickly, voice wavering. "We know we were not perfect. Maybe we made mistakes, but we tried our best. Avery, you have to understand parenting is hard." His excuses drifted off when he finally looked up and saw my expression. "Parenting is not supposed to be easy, Dad," I said softly, "but it is not supposed to break your child either." He swallowed hard, looking suddenly older. "I am sorry," he murmured the words barely audible. "I do not expect forgiveness. I only hope someday you might see that we are still your family." "Family," I repeated slowly, tasting the word, testing its weight. My mother tried again, stepping forward. "We can fix this, Avery. We can rebuild." She reached for my arm instinctively, but I stepped back and her hand dropped uselessly to her side. "Fix this," I echoed, incredulous. "Mom, you watched me on the floor gasping for air, and you did nothing. Dad did nothing. You let Ben hurt me for years. You called me sensitive, dramatic, ungrateful when I tried to speak up. You told relatives I was unstable. You let Grandma die believing I did not love her. You erased me from her life, from your life." My mother shook her head, tears falling freely now. "I was overwhelmed," she whispered. "I was trying to keep the peace, trying to hold the family together. You were always so fragile and Ben was so strong. I thought I was doing what was best. I could not stop the bitter truth from rising. You sacrificed me to make your lives easier." The words hung in the air, heavier than the mist curling around us. She sobbed harder, covering her face, but I did not move to comfort her. I had spent enough years comforting people who hurt me. My father finally spoke, voice cracking. Avery, please, we are not asking for the past to disappear. We are just asking for a chance. We want to be part of your life again. We want to know you, your work, your world. We want to know the woman you became. For a long time, I stood silent, feeling the wind brush cool against my skin, hearing distant traffic, the faint buzz of city life far removed from the Wisconsin night where I almost died. That girl on the floor had begged for air, and no one moved. This woman standing in the doorway owed them nothing. Not her forgiveness, not her time, not her pain. I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the moment. I believe you want that, I said calmly. I really do. But wanting and deserving are not the same. My mother lowered her hands, her face blotchy and stunned. So you will not forgive us, she whispered. I met her gaze, steady, unwavering. Forgiveness is not the issue. Access is. You do not get access to my life anymore. I am not punishing you. I am protecting myself, and that protection has been long overdue. My father let out a quiet, defeated sigh. Is there any hope? He asked, almost pleading. Not today, I answered gently. Maybe not ever. But that is something you will have to carry, not me. My mother reached out one last time, voice trembling. Avery, please. We love you. I felt the words like hollow echoes of something they believed about themselves, not something I had ever felt from them. Love is action, I said softly, and you acted only when your world fell apart. They stood there frozen, absorbing the truth. I opened the door wider, not to invite them in, but to make it clear the conversation was over. Take care of yourselves, I said. Then I stepped back and closed the door quietly, feeling no anger, no triumph, only a profound stillness spreading through me like the first breath after years underwater. For the first time in my life, I felt free. In the weeks that followed, shutting the door on my parents, something inside me began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, like the gradual thaw of winter, when the air softens before you even notice the ice melting. For the first time in my life, I woke without a weight pressing on my chest. A weight I had carried for so long, I mistook it for part of my anatomy. Seattle's morning light came through my windows differently. Brighter, gentler, warmer somehow, though I knew it was not the sun that had changed it, was me. I went to work feeling a strange sense of steadiness, pausing sometimes when I heard the wheeze of a patient struggling to breathe, remembering the girl I had been and the terrifying night that had shaped everything. But instead of feeling trapped inside that memory, I began to feel something like purpose, as though every breath I coached someone through stitched together a small tear inside myself. The idea for the Eleanor Fund came to me one evening while I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at my grandmother's journal, reading her looping handwriting where she had written that she hoped I would someday know I deserved love. I realized then that the inheritance I had received was never meant to be money. It was meant to be freedom and a legacy, and I wanted to honor her not by holding on to it, but by multiplying it. So I created a foundation for survivors of family psychological abuse. People who needed help with therapy, legal advice, relocation, or simply a safe starting point to rebuild their lives. Filling out the paperwork felt surreal, like I was cutting a ribbon on a future my family had tried to keep shut from me. As the fund grew with small donations from strangers who wrote letters saying, "Your story gave me courage," or "I thought I was alone," or "I left because of you," I felt a fragile pride forming inside me like a new lung growing where the damaged one used to be. On weekends, I began attending support groups not as a spokesperson and not as a victim, but as someone who had survived and could sit with others in the quiet understanding that comes from shared pain. People told their stories, broken, cracked, brave stories, and every time someone said I thought it was just me, I felt something inside me root deeper into the present. One woman in her 60s with silver hair and soft eyes told me she had spent 40 years trying to be the daughter her mother wanted and never once the daughter she needed to be for herself. When she said hearing your story made me walk away, I realized that healing is not a moment, it is a movement, a slow turning toward your own worth. I also began writing something I had never imagined I would do. At first, it was fragments, memories, bits of dialogue that had lived rent-free in my mind for decades. Eventually, those fragments formed chapters, and those chapters formed a book I titled The Night I Could Not Breathe. Not because I wanted to relive the trauma, but because I finally understood the power of naming what once tried to silence me. Writing was not easy. My hands often shook, and some sentences felt like I was dragging them out of a wound, but every page became evidence that I was alive, that the girl who almost died had grown into a woman who could tell her story in her own voice on her own terms. Nora read the first draft, wiping her eyes and saying softly, "You are going to save people with this." I believed her because writing it had already begun to save me. Healing did not mean I stopped thinking about my family entirely. Sometimes at night, I wondered what became of Ben after everything collapsed around him, whether he blamed me or still clung to the belief that he was the victim. Sometimes I thought about my mother sitting alone in her quiet Wisconsin house, surrounded by church ladies who no longer called and neighbors who whispered behind curtains. Sometimes I remembered my father's voice breaking when he said he did not expect forgiveness. But instead of anger, I began to feel distance, a healthy distance like closing a book I no longer needed to reference. I knew that healing did not require me to reconcile with them or to reopen wounds that had finally begun to clot. Healing simply required honesty, and the honest truth was that my life had become bigger than the pain they gave me. One evening, as I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, I felt the cool breeze brush my face, carrying the faint sound of traffic and seagulls, and the soft hum of Seattle settling into dusk. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. A full, unhurried breath. Something I could not have done that night on the living room floor so many years ago. I thought of the girl gasping for air while the people who were supposed to love her stood still. I thought of the woman now breathing freely at last. They tried to make you disappear, I told myself. Instead, you learned how to exist louder. My phone buzzed with a message from a support group participant thanking me for speaking last week and saying she had finally moved out of her toxic home. Another message came from Marisol telling me she had just received a job offer from a new company, one that valued her after everything she had endured. I smiled, realizing the ripple effect of truth stretches further than we ever anticipate. I looked again at my grandmother's picture framed on my desk, her arm wrapped around the shoulders of a girl who had no idea yet how much strength she carried. I whispered, "Thank you." Not just for the inheritance or the journal, but for seeing me long before I learned to see myself. As the sun dipped below the skyline, I picked up my pen, opening the notebook I kept beside my writing desk. On the first page of the book's dedication, I wrote, "For everyone who has ever been told they are too sensitive, too dramatic, too much, you deserve to breathe freely." Then I added a final line, one that came to me like a truth I had always known but had only now learned to say. They tried to silence me when I was gasping for air, but I learned to breathe without them. And with that, I realized the beginning of my life had finally arrived. If you reached this point in my story, I want to speak directly to you because maybe something in these chapters of my life felt familiar. Maybe you have lived through years of being dismissed, overlooked, or told your pain was an exaggeration. Maybe you learned to swallow your voice because the people who should have protected you taught you it was safer to stay silent. I want you to know you are not alone. Not then, not now, not ever. For too many of us, family was supposed to mean safety, but instead became a place where we were made to doubt our own memories, our own worth, our own breath. And if you have ever been made to feel invisible by the people who claimed to love you, I hope my story reminds you that your truth matters and your healing is not only possible, but deserved. Maybe you are watching this from a quiet living room after the kids are grown, or maybe you are listening late at night because you cannot sleep with memories that still sting. Or maybe you simply stumbled here because you needed to hear someone put words to the confusion you have carried for years. Wherever you are in your journey, I want to invite you to share your story in the comments below because when one person speaks up, another finds courage. And when one voice refuses to be silenced, it creates space for others to step into the light. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me how far this story travels. Tell me if you have ever faced a family member who crossed a line so deeply it changed the course of your life. Tell me if you have found healing or if you are still searching for it. We grow stronger not by pretending everything is fine, but by acknowledging the truth, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. If someone made you feel small, you get to reclaim your space. If someone convinced you that you were the problem, you get to rewrite the narrative. And if someone ever held power over your breath, your choices, or your freedom, you get to take all of that back one step at a time. If this story spoke to you even a little, I hope you will subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter. These stories are not just entertainment, they are lifelines for people who have spent too long in the dark believing they were alone. You are not alone. Your pain is real, your strength is real, and your voice matters more than you know.